back to False Dichotomies. I'm Cy Castells.
I'm Daria Quinn.
And last week we talked about a contemporary mainstream comic, Ms. Marvel. Somewhat mainstream anyway. And this week we're going to take it back and talk about a comic series that was very obscure and independent. It was one of the webcomics in the early days of webcomics. That is the late 90s and early 2000s. And it was called Bruno by Christopher Baldwin. And I personally really love webcomics because, especially back then, when mainstream comics were much more cautious about doing stories about minorities or unusual stories, although you would probably know a lot more about it than I.
Mainstream comics in the 90s. Dude, like it's all like blood and guns and pouches and big muscles and women in bikinis and they're all fighting like other guys and huge muscles and it's so cool. Blood gun number 1! Oh, yeah. Rob Liefeld rules! Okay.
Yeah. So we have that in mainstream comics, and then in the internet, which is still relatively new, but gaining in popularity so that you could actually reach a pretty wide audience through the internet, people started making webcomics. And yes. At first, I believe it was mostly people who had worked in the comics industry or tried to work in the comics industry and felt like they wanted to tell stories that the mainstream publishers didn't want to tell.
Right.
So they would take their business to the internet. And that resulted in two main changes in the dynamic. One is that you had more diverse creators making more diverse stories. Mm-hmm. And number two, because most of them were available to readers for free. I mean, as free as you can get when it takes a significant amount of privilege to even have an internet connection.
Yeah.
Because remember, this was back in the dial-up days. Oh, wow. It basically was the Stone Age.
It was 15 minutes for a JPEG to load.
But still, if you lived in a household with an internet connection, but you couldn't afford to go down to the comic shop every week and drop upwards of $20 on all the different comic series.
And that's actually a conservative number even for the late 90s.
Bruno was one of these comics. And it's unlike the bloodbath of toxic masculinity you described earlier. Bruno is a decade-long slice of life story about a 20-something queer, mixed race, feminist woman who suffers from periodic depression and has, for most of the series, very little direction in life, has basically no roots. She drifts from place to place and from life to life, basically, and acquires a huge array of relationships and friendships and connections and the story basically tells her coming of age as kind of the archetypal example of I think the term that sometimes gets thrown around these days is adultolescent.
Yeah.
That is like the period of early adulthood where you're clearly no longer a child and you can't really call yourself an adolescent anymore, but you haven't quite settled into full adulthood yet. And that time period seems to be going on longer and longer as our society gets more complex and it's harder to really settle into a lifestyle and a settled life because everything is changing and there's way too many options.
The thing that really struck me about Bruno was it was hard for me to believe that I was reading a comic that was being produced as early as 1995.
Yeah, and that's what I said. Like I said, the webcomics world, especially back then, that was like as far as I'm concerned, where the counterculture was.
Mm-hmm.
There were a ton of webcomics back then that really broke ground for and really set the stage for a lot of the culture that we see today. Because, like, a lot of webcomic artists ended up getting enough success in their independent industry that they got picked up by mainstream comic publishers. I know that there were a couple of webcomic artists from that era, and I forgot their names, but they ended up collaborating later on the Adventure Time comic. But yeah, when a like mainstream children's cartoon got adapted into a comic series, they picked up webcomic artists to make it, and that is pretty amazing.
Well, the other part of why it seemed to astound me that it was being made like in like 1995 was it doesn't read like a story of somebody that was living in 1995.
Yeah.
It's so reflective of today's sort of gig economy, where, you know, having a single permanent job is sort of an impossibility for people in our age range. You were saying before about how there's this sort of adultolescence in our 20s. And the first thing I thought is, well, we're the generation that came up with the term adulting.
Yes.
To describe being responsible about things in our lives, such as paying rent and bills and grocery shopping and all that kind of stuff.
And we wouldn't need a word for it if it were just a normal part of our lives.
But it's not.
Yeah.
And
it's something we kind of have to, like, figure out on our own.
And some of it was because we weren't taught these kinds of things when we were younger and needed to be taught.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that the world has a tendency of throwing its young people to the wolves.
Yeah. And I think one of the reasons that Bruno, the character, is one of the is a character who experienced that a little bit ahead of time, like in regards to her society, is because she is queer and mixed race and a woman and not really comfortable fitting into any of the available stereotypes. So there wasn't a set role for her in her world that she could easily fit into. So she had to create her own. Yeah. And that's something that more and more the whites and cis and straight and male people in our world are experiencing more nowadays as our traditional roles are breaking down, and some people consider that a bad thing. I personally consider it a good thing because it gives us more options. But in the process of our culture changing in this way, we have a lot of people who are left to figure things out on their own rather than have social structures in place.
Right. So Bruno's story begins. She is on holiday vacation, and she is going back to school for winter semester.
Except she doesn't finish that semester.
From what I understand, she didn't even make it through the first week.
Yep.
Before she was like, I'm done.
Yeah. So her arc basically begins with her dropping out of school. I was actually thinking we could start with like talking about some of the characters.
Okay.
Because I think that they're really what make this comic what it is. It's very much a comic about people because there isn't a whole lot in terms of events going on. It's more about people and their relationships and their feelings. Lots and lots of feelings. So, starting with the main character, Bruno. So we talked a little bit about. What did you think of her?
I am intrigued that a character like this was ever allowed to see print.
Self-publishing.
Yeah, obviously that's the nature in which this character needed to be published in, because I'm not even sure that a character like Bruno would be published now outside of an independent, maybe Image Comics would let this happen, but I was under the impression that this was in a college newspaper for about a year or two.
Yeah, I think that he first created the character as a recurring strip in his college newspaper, but then it really took form in webcomics.
And I just remember, I feel like I remember reading something about that he tried to get it syndicated in like actual newspapers. And here's how I think the conversation went. Yeah, right. Get the fuck out of here. Yeah, we're not publishing this. You're crazy.
Yeah, and so it's not just because of like her, particular identity. She has a style of living and a style of communicating that's very headstrong, very independent, but also really focusless, where she's like, she has very clear ideas of what she doesn't like, but not really any clear ideas of what she does like.
Yeah. I think what would be one of the barriers to Bruno being published by a mainstream company to even today is the fact that there really is no plot.
No, there isn't. And that's part of the story, I think. It's like sometimes our lives seem to have no plot, and we still have to try and figure out what are we doing and why, and try to find meaning in our lives.
Right. I think Bruno is a unique character, even if you strip away all of the identity thing. If you strip away the fact that she is a biracial queer woman, if you just take that away, if Bruno were a blank slate, she is a very interesting character.
Yeah, and like one of the things that I also love about her is that she's not indiscriminate in her affections, but she looks for very different criteria when it comes to her romantic partners.
Yeah.
For instance, throughout the story, she has sexual relationships with a much older man. She seeks a romantic relationship and gets rejected by a man who is extremely overweight. Throughout the series, she just is attracted to people based on their personality and their spirit, I think.
Yes.
And their intelligence and their creativity, and not so much their physical features or their attractiveness in a conventional sense.
Or even very specific personality traits. I feel like Bruno does not necessarily know what she is looking for.
Yeah. So
she's kind of trying everything out to see what will work and what isn't. And I also feel like she develops close bonds with people that even people that she should in theory despise.
Yeah, I think also like she has an attraction to people who treat her with respect.
Yes. And
who see her for who she is. People who recognize her as more than just a pretty face.
Right.
Who appreciate her intelligence and her wit, and who she can really have fun with.
And I would imagine that it is very difficult to be friends with someone like Bruno.
Yeah, she's extremely temperamental. She's extremely unreliable. She's like...
I mean, you would have to be the kind of person that Bruno would actually like to be around in order to want to be around her.
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily say this because I feel that she's a very caustic character. I feel she's a chaotic character.
Oh, yeah. She's very difficult to pin down, and I think that's partly because if you try to pin her down, she will start hating you for it.
Yes.
She very much resists categorization and stagnation. Whenever things get to be a little bit too samey, she just has to break free and go do something completely different for a while. Like literally, like just leave home and hitchhike until she finds something interesting, which is how she meets one of the most interesting characters in the series, Stanley.
Yes.
And he's like, I consider him like one of the central figures of the story, even though he's not like always in it. So how does Bruno meet Stanley? Okay,
so Bruno is attempting to get away from her life And she ends up lost in the middle of nowhere and just walking and walking and walking and walking until she sort of stumbles upon Stanley in his seclusion.
Yes. And he is very much a hermit.
Yes.
He lives in a house in the woods, far away from humanity.
He is an author, a somewhat prominent one at that.
And yeah, and that's how he manages to keep up his isolated lifestyle. Is all he has to do is write a book every couple years, and his publisher will keep him like paid and happy. Well,
as happy as Stanley can be.
Yes, which is very, very much dependent on other factors.
Yes, he has somewhat of a tragic backstory,
which we can get
which we will get into later.
So Stanley is like relishing his isolation and contented in his aloneness, and he's not a young man. He's at least middle aged at this point, and suddenly this early 20s young girl passes out on his front step. Yeah. And he has to take her inside and warm her up and reluctantly allow her to stay with him for a little while. Right. Which he's not happy about at first because, again, he likes being alone. But it turns out that Bruno is not any ordinary girl. And they end up forming a really interesting bond. Yes. And just as they are about to consummate their
relationship would be the word.
Their mutual attraction at least.
Yes. A circus comes to town.
Yeah.
And breaks down and ends up staying with Stanley and Bruno for at least a month.
So not only is Stanley dealing with this agent of chaos, he also has to deal with an entire circus.
And we're talking a literal entire circus here.
Yes, with horses and
clowns
acrobats.
And something else that I really, really enjoy about Bruno is that it embraces sort of the ludicrous nature that is allowed when you're doing the daily comic strip. So you can have an entire circus move in with Stanley. Yeah. Or you can have, for example, Bruno has a bad breakup with Donna. And her depression worsens to the point where she's about to commit suicide. And she does so in such a cartoonish way. Because she has a cinder block in hand, literally chained to her ankle. And she's going to throw herself off a bridge. And she even tells her one friend, "Oh, by the way, I'm going to go throw myself off a bridge. Cinder block in hand, chained to ankle." And the friend's like, "Okay, have fun."
Yeah, because her friends don't necessarily realize that she's not joking. Yeah. Which is something that I really find when my own friends casually talk about suicide, and I don't know whether they're joking or not. Right. And yeah, I have a lot of depressed friends, and some of them are suicidal, and some of them joke about suicide, and there is some overlap. So that's a little bit nerve-wracking to me. So I definitely understand, her friend who doesn't quite get it. But, yeah, that is a doozy.
And the thing is, that's also followed up by the fact that she goes through with it.
Yes.
And some guy drags her out of the river and then feels entitled to sex.
Yeah, I saved your life.
I was trying to kill myself. What the fuck is wrong with you?
Also, who goes fishing in the river for suicidal women as their courtship behavior?
This is one hell of a white night, let me tell you.
Yeah, and very white as well. He literally strips off his shirt because somehow he thinks that's gonna help.
Yeah. I also appreciate how Bruno, the comic, does not hold back in its utter contempt for these kind of men.
Yes, which is also impressive for the late 90s. Yes. We still have problems with these kinds of guys in 2019. And And we still have anti-feminists who are like, what are you complaining about? I'm just trying to be nice. But like, and especially coming from a male author is especially impressive.
So we have Stanley, we have Jay. Jay is presented to us as sort of an antagonist.
Yeah, he is Bruno's sometimes roommate, I guess.
Yes.
And a conservative evangelical Christian for the beginning of the story.
Right.
His relationship with Bruno is, I don't even know how they came to be roommates. Maybe they were roommates in college or something like that. But
I was under the impression that she was living with several people.
Yeah.
Isn't she sort of like living with Lenny?
Yeah.
And I can't remember her name, the painter. Mm-hmm. And that Jay was living with them at a point. Yeah.
So group housing arrangements, not that uncommon amongst lower to middle class people in, let's be clear, one of the most expensive areas to live in the United States. This is taking place in, I think, Northampton, Massachusetts. Yeah.
So we're working at the Moody Cow.
The Moody Cow, the local convenience store. Yeah. It does not pay a living wage.
Yeah, it's like I always have to remember, okay, there's the Moody Cow and there's the Dippy Donut.
So Jay was this evangelical Christian, sometimes roommate. They, of course, clash on every level because he's a sexist and she's a feminist. He's a Christian and she's a kind of against organized religion of all kinds, I guess.
Yeah.
Her spirituality is not really defined, and it's kind of, although she definitely draws from certain aspects of paganism and New Age spirituality.
And that's something that develops later on, too. It's not something that is inherent in the beginning.
Yeah. She has spiritual experiences, but she doesn't necessarily have religious beliefs.
Yes.
So they've always kind of clashed. And then Jay gets a really bad flu and is like delirious with fever for days on end. And Bruno is taking care of him. And people are asking her, why are you taking care of him? Don't you hate him? and it's like she's just like, I think she says that it's kind of out of spite.
Yeah.
But then when he recovers from his fever, he's had a vision. He's been told to go west.
This is very out of character for Jay.
Yes.
Jay is not the kind of person who just picks up and goes. That's a Bruno thing. It's actually one of the things that he has criticized Bruno about. So when Jay decides that he's going to do this, he asks Bruno to tag along, and she does.
Yeah, she knows how to wander.
She could use the help.
I think he kind of recognizes her as a potential guide through this wilderness because she kind of inhabits the wilderness as a natural fact.
And as we go along in this sort of aimless trek, even Bruno seems to get annoyed by the fact that there is no destination.
Yeah,
they're just going. And at one point, she begins to question if Jay has any idea.
Yeah,
where.
I wonder if that's like the combination of his Christian beliefs and the strength of this vision that he's received, because he's been raised to believe in a biblical history where prophets would receive visions and talk to angels and talk directly to God and receive these arcane, mysterious instructions that they would just follow without question.
But the strange thing about this pilgrimage for Jay is it's his deconversion. He loses his religion on this trip.
Yeah, and so he's having this crisis of faith while he's on this pilgrimage that he literally received in a fever dream. And they go all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast. For a time they were traveling with Bruno's mother.
Yes. Bruno's mother left her father and ended up staying in Minneapolis.
Yeah. and which is also a very interesting character arc for her as well. Mother following in the daughter's footsteps a little bit with like rejecting the life that she had been living with her husband, who is also a conservative Christian,
but didn't start off that way.
Yeah.
He apparently was very much a free-spirited vagabond in his early years, when he married Bruno's mother and had Bruno, and somewhere along the line he reconverted to his religion and tried to stuff everybody else in his family into the same box.
Yes, which is a story that sounds familiar to me. I think it might have been something we talked about the other day.
I believe that's almost a literal interpretation of my life. But whereas, the daughter flat out openly rejects the father's religion, and the mother is sort of kowtowed into it until one day even she realizes she can't stand to be around this guy anymore.
So she ends up traveling and staying in Minneapolis, and really finding like a life there that she's happy with. But Bruno and Jay, they have to keep going west because Jay has not found whatever he's looking for yet. And I think they meet at least one other person on the way.
Yes, I can't remember.
A hitchhiker.
Name. Yeah, there was a hitchhiker they picked up.
Yeah.
That seemed to have a lot more in common with Bruno.
Mm-hmm.
And they end up dropping her, I believe, in Seattle.
Yeah.
Or somewhere near
there. Yeah, because that was her destination. And then they keep going until they find the Pacific Ocean. And Jay is like, okay, I went west. This is as far west as I can go. What now? And so they end up heading back.
And they get lost.
As you do.
And they come across a commune.
Mm-hmm. But before they do that, though...
Before
they do that...
They hook up.
They hook up, which is completely out of the blue.
But in a way, sort of not.
Yeah, because like they've been having this like antagonistic relationship. It's one of those like things where sometimes when you're enemies long enough, you kind of have to become friends.
Yeah.
And of course, they're both young and attractive, and they've spent so much time together on this trip that like they have to have become pretty intimate, at least emotionally.
Right.
And then they become intimate physically, and that's when things get a little bit
complicated.
Yeah, because Bruno is very much accustomed to casual hookups.
And
he's formerly a conservative Christian who believes in abstinence until monogamy.
Yeah.
And
so when the consummation ends and it does not develop into a long-term relationship with Bruno, Jay resents it. They come across a commune
of like legit hippies
where Jay finds someone else.
Yeah. And like within a few days they are hopping over the broomstick. which is a pagan wedding tradition.
Yes.
Is hopping over the broomstick to signify that you are entering a new life of domestic bliss. And then Bruno has to basically come to terms with the fact that she's leaving and he is staying. And
well, one of the conditions of this situation was that he was going to give her his car and his bank account. In exchange, he does not want Bruno to come to his wedding. And he did so because he was looking to sever ties to an old life. And she was the only one left. And she takes that incredibly hard.
Yeah. It's because it's like, yeah, she didn't want to be romantically entangled with him, but she didn't necessarily want to lose him entirely. So she ends up, I think, watching the wedding from an attic window.
She is having sex with one of the commune ladies. I think one of the head commune people.
Oh yeah.
So I don't think she actually watched the wedding. I think she was too busy doing
other things. Yes. Now, I think it's time to touch on something. This is a comic that takes place in what is functionally the real world.
Mm-hmm.
It's mostly takes place in a pretty mundane version of reality. But we also have like random circuses popping up.
Yeah.
And hippie communes.
Conveniently placed in the place where you get lost.
Later on, we have like sightings of ghosts.
Yes.
And, which we can get into soon. Dreams also mean things. Like Jay had his vision. But we also have, later on, we have extended dream sequences of where Bruno receives, like, wisdom from some source that isn't quite defined.
Right.
So there's this sort of pseudo-spiritual reality going on. And it's never quite said right out whether it's real or just something that the characters are interpreting as real. But one thing I find really satisfying about it, because I experience life that way. I have spiritual experiences that I can't say for sure whether they were real or not. But I find that my life works better if I act as if they are real. There's this genre distinction in fiction between fantasy and realistic fiction that a lot of people draw that line to the right of ghosts and visions and leave the ghosts and visions on the fantasy side. Whereas those are not things that we have all agreed are fantasies.
Right.
And that's another reason I think that Bruno would have a really hard time being published in the mainstream, because if it were being published as a fantasy, people would be like, why isn't there more fantasy in it? And if it were being published as realistic, people would be like, why are there ghosts and visions?
And the theory I've come across when it comes to Bruno's ghosts and visions are they are, if they are not meant to be taken literally, and I think in some cases they are. If they are not meant to be taken literally, they are the representation of Bruno's mental illness. And her depression and her guilt. And when it comes to Stanley's situation and how Bruno discovers Stanley's son in Sump Pump, I think that a lot of that had to do with the fact that Bruno was isolated in this house for months and she kind of went nuts. So was the ghost of Stanley's son real, or was the ghost of Stanley's son something that Bruno hallucinated while finding this horrific backstory?
So let's talk about Stanley's son.
Second
time that Bruno is visiting Stanley, I think.
Yes. Stanley has offered to pay off Bruno's debts from the sojourn with Jay in order to watch his house. And he does not give Bruno a reason why he's leaving, just that he's leaving.
And he doesn't know how long he will be gone either, but it ends up being quite a while. Again, this is a house in the middle of the woods, very far from civilization. And Bruno is being tasked with house sitting. And it's worth noting that Bruno is not necessarily an extrovert. I think she does appreciate alone time, but she has not had cause, as Stanley does, to seek out isolation as a general lifestyle. She still very much seeks out human companionship. So living alone in this house just does not suit her very well. As you said, she may have gone a little bit nuts.
Well, I mean, she was basically living in the kitchen.
Yeah.
Because the house was too big for her. And this, of course, is also compounded with the fact that Bruno already has depression, probably bipolar. I'm not going to go on the whole super diagnostic thing, but I would imagine that there are symptoms of borderline personality.
I don't know. I've never really gotten any clear idea of what Bruno's specific problem is.
I think part of that, too, is that she doesn't go into therapy.
No. Well, not yet.
Okay. So So I am right. She is. She will eventually. Good. 'Cause
Yes.
She needs it.
Yes, she definitely needs it, and that's coming. Don't worry. And she benefits greatly from it. But I'm getting ahead of ourselves.
This might be a good time to explain that we are only talking about the first half of the series.
Yes, we're talking about books 1 through 5 of the printed versions, or up until the
2000,
up until the beginning of 2000 in the chronology. So while Bruno is in this big empty house all alone, she ends up needing to go into the basement to relight the pilot light.
Yes.
And she finds a ghost of a little boy with a wound on his head. And he talks to her. Mm-hmm. And then she does some digging in Stanley's drawers, and she finds evidence that he's married and had a child. And that child has mysteriously disappeared.
As it turns out, the child did not disappear. He fell into the sump pump in the basement and died.
Mm-hmm. So she calls the local police, who drain the sump pump and find the body. And Stanley ends up getting told.
This while he is sitting dutifully by his wife's deathbed.
Yes, because she has been ever since their child's disappearance, she has been in a mental hospital. And that's why Bruno did not meet her the first time they met. Stanley is in this horrible position of saying goodbye to his wife after she has been ill for so long, and has just learned the fate of his son. And oof, that was
a Daria, you need to put this book down and do anything else right now.
Yeah.
And I believe, literally the first thing I did was contact you to let you know that I hit that point.
Yeah.
And
I was like, yeah, that is, of all the points you could stop, that's the point that's gonna hit you.
Yeah, I think I took a week off after that. And that's the power of the writing in this comic, is that it can blindside you with something that heavy, but it doesn't feel out of place.
Yeah, because we've already established that Stanley is an extremely private person, that he is very, very secretive about his feelings, about his past, about his motivations. When they first met, he hid the fact that he's actually a really excellent cook, and then sat through days and days of Bruno trying to teach him how to cook, and he continuing to pretend to be bad at cooking,
which sort of had a conflicting purpose, because he told Bruno that he did that so he could get rid of her, but
then he kept going because
it kept her
of
around.
walls. Yeah,
it kept her around.
Yeah.
So it's like he wanted to get rid of her, but then he didn't want to get rid of her.
Typical dude doesn't know what he wants.
Well, he did want something.
Yeah. Also, a typical dude doesn't know how to express his feelings. But also, of course he can't express his feelings. He's been through so much, and he's had no outlet for it. And he writes books, but they're not I think it's established they're kind of lowbrow, schlocky books until Bruno comes around and inspires him to write something a bit more substantive. So he's very much like a person who lives all in his head, and he doesn't really relate to other people. And when we find out why, it's it never necessarily occurred to the reader that there was a reason like this for why he is the way he is. But once you find out, it makes perfect sense. And it also makes perfect sense why he would be attracted to someone as young and vibrant and intelligent and compatible as Bruno, but also want to keep her at arm's length, because he has all of this still unresolved in his life.
Well, Bruno's complicated relationship with Stanley also extends on her end.
Mm-hmm.
Because after the revelation of his wife and son, Bruno ends the physical relationship with Stanley.
Mm-hmm.
And it is done because she did not want to replace Stanley's wife in his mind. But yet they continue to have this sort of complicated relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because they're just too emotionally entangled at that point.
And where, for lack of a better term, Bruno would serve as his beard,
mm-hmm.
in a sense. For the non-queer folk that have no idea what I just said, a beard is what a gay person will have. A gay person pretending to be in a relationship with someone of the opposite sex, the term is called beard.
Yeah. Usually it's a gay man with a woman who is ostensibly his partner in public.
Yeah. So that, I mean, in a sense, that's the role that Bruno is playing with Stanley, mm-hmm. As he goes to these publisher parties that he hates.
Yes. Because they're full of people.
And he ends up hooking up with one of the hostesses of mm-hmm. these parties.
I wonder if I sometimes wonder if this is something that happened because Bruno was the exception to his loyalty to his wife,
right.
Even when he couldn't have a relationship with her. And once his wife had passed and he started to recover from that loss, mm-hmm. Suddenly his libido woke up and he started to look at other women as potential mates. Mm-hmm. And with Bruno no longer a acceptable partner at that time, he starts to look at, women his own age.
Well, the thing about it is he's very lavish as far as his gifts to Bruno. He mm-hmm. buys her a laptop. He gets her this really expensive dress. Mm-hmm. But he will go to these parties and he will completely abandon her.
Yeah.
And even though she's made it clear that she's not necessarily in a romantic relationship with this person, she does take especially the second abandonment very hard. She ends up walking out of the party, stops off at something like the Waffle House, mm-hmm. and
off-brand Waffle House,
and she hooks up with the clerk, and there's a ceremony where she ends up burning the really expensive dress.
Mm-hmm. We're dealing with two people who have been traumatized in their life in very different ways, but mm-hmm. still, but they have bonded through that trauma, and they can't help but be affected by one another, but they also can't fully relate to one another in a healthy way yet. So inevitably they're just going to end up hurting one another.
So it's interesting. It's like, a lot of people would read this as, well, I mean, you ended this relationship. What did you expect to happen? But it's also kind of like the reductive patriarchal thinking.
And also, you can know that you're not capable of being in a relationship with someone and also not be ready to see them be with someone else yet.
Right. So, yet another aspect that you won't see in a mainstream story is these very complicated relationships mm-hmm. where it's not about possession, it's not about ownership, it's not about sex or any, necessarily. It's that it's allowing, especially a woman character, to be complicated and not necessarily have a clear-cut relationship with a man.
Yeah.
Or in Bruno's case, well, with anybody, but especially men.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's I want to talk a little bit about the Bruno's bisexuality.
Yeah.
The fact that she has relationships with men and women.
Yes.
I think quantitatively she ends up being with more men than women.
Yes.
The men she ends up with are usually messed up in some way.
And the women she ends up with are far too mentally healthy for her. at this point.
Yeah, she ends up like sort of bringing them down a bit.
Yeah, the first major relationship Bruno has in the series is with a woman named Donna that she meets on a very long flight, and they first hook up in the airplane bathroom.
Yes.
So
Mile High Club.
So Bruno develops this very intense relationship with Donna, but Donna can't handle Bruno's moodiness, her depressive cycles, and her lack of social ability. Donna is young and energetic. She has a life, and she travels for a living. And she just came to a point where it's like, all I ever do is fight with Bruno, so I can't continue this relationship. And Bruno takes it incredibly hard.
Yeah. And I know because I've been on Bruno's side of relationships like that. I've always had severe emotional problems, sometimes worse than other times. And more often than not, the people who have dumped me because, in their words, I was too emotionally unstable for them. And I don't know if that's the actual reason, because very few people can actually put into words the reason why they break up with someone. But yeah, it's really hard because it's not something you can just change. Yeah. And on some level, you know that it's your responsibility, but you can't really say truthfully that it's your fault.
Oh, the thing about emotional instability is it's also the eye of the beholder. You know? You could probably be perfectly fine, and the other person will find you an emotional burden for reasons that, compatibility reasons.
Yeah.
It isn't necessarily that Bruno was intentionally dragging Donna down. It was the fact that they were not a very compatible fit. And Bruno did not see it that way. Bruno took it as a personal fault.
Which, considering Bruno's personality,
that's
bound to happen. She's very, she definitely personalizes things.
Yeah. And I feel like I have that in common with her, or at least I would if I had more relationships.
Yeah, that's one of those things where you might wish for it, but do you really know what you're wishing for?
Yeah, the thing is maybe not, but shouldn't I have the option?
Yeah.
And so Bruno takes the breakup with Donna hard, so much so that she contemplates and attempts suicide.
Yeah, which we already got into.
The interesting thing about this is that she hasn't tried again yet. And usually someone with that sort of emotional instability who has attempted suicide would have tried again by now.
I get the impression that, a lot of this story is about her emotional maturity. And part of that is learning healthier ways of interpreting her experiences, learning not to personalize things as much, and learning how to have healthier relationships. And that's something that you will see in the second half. She gets a whole lot better at managing herself and her relationships. Part of that's therapy. Part of that is knowing healthier people who teach her better ways of relating.
Well, I feel like that's one of the things I was seeing in her relationship and breakup with Dan.
Yes.
She hooks up with a guy that works at, I believe he works at the Dippy Donut?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so he
and Bruno, he's very much a typical dude too.
Yeah, Bruno is
he's not the last typical dude she'll be with.
So Bruno is a regular at the Dippy Donut because Bruno likes her coffee,
and the coffee there is cheap.
And she meets this guy named Dan. It's sort of that, he's at work. Do you really want to hit on a guy while he's at work sort of thing?
It's a little bit of a different dynamic when it's a guy who's working in the service industry.
Yeah.
Because the power dynamic is very different. But yeah, it's not something you necessarily want to do. But
they hook up.
But they do hook up. And I think it's like Dan wouldn't necessarily have gone for her necessarily, but she's there and she's interested and she's frankly hot. Mm-hmm. So, and he's a typical dude. So what are you gonna do? Say no?
And Dan, as far as you say, he's like the typical dude. He kind of represents sort of the typical dude mindset about how relationships work and how men are quote unquote supposed to relate to women, as far as, for a lack of a better term, ownership. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he definitely feels entitled to her time and attention in a way that she's not really willing to give.
Mm-hmm. Well, part of it is that Bruno is a writer. Mm-hmm. And
that's something that Stanley kind of encourages in her.
Yes.
And that's why he gave her a laptop.
Yeah. So, we first really see Bruno's writing aspirations in a ongoing series for a magazine. Mm-hmm. She gets picked up to write this ongoing story for a magazine, and of what we were shown in the comics of this story, this magazine must have had a very low bar. Yeah, as far as what is acceptable.
Yeah, it's kind of a whimsical, dreamlike, childlike story, without a whole lot of plot. Kind of like Bruno, except for younger viewers.
Yeah. So Bruno is writing what I would personally consider really bad material for a magazine that must not have very high standards. And she is also doing this while she's on the road with Jay. Mm-hmm. So other people are reading it, and especially the one hitchhiker is like, they actually pay you to write this crap? What the hell? So she wants to be a writer, but she doesn't really have her craft down yet.
Yeah, it takes time to nail it down. Yeah, and taken me about 20 years.
And Stanley is encouraging her. Mm-hmm. Because, well, one, he's a professional writer. Mm-hmm. Two, he obviously sees something in what Bruno is doing and knows that she can improve. And three,
and she's young, so she actually can improve. It's very different than if you're like middle-aged and writing like really bad stuff, because at that point your ability to really improve is a little bit limited, both by the amount of time you have left and the amount of like growth that your brain is capable of. Mm-hmm.
So Bruno is doing that. Meanwhile, she has a job writing copy for a newspaper. She's doing human interest stories. Mm-hmm. Bruno is doing human interest stories.
Well, she is an interesting human.
But when she was given the job, she was just like, okay, so I write a bunch of tripe. Gotcha.
Okay.
But of course, her boss does not. She up and leaves and goes off with Jay for 6 months, and then she comes back and she expects there to still be a job. Yeah, especially since
she's not quite figured out that you can't just fucking do that.
Yeah. Well, before this, she was really dismissive of her boss anyway. As because her boss is kind of an asshole. But he's the asshole that runs your newspaper.
Yeah, and under capitalism, the boss is king.
Yeah, essentially. So anyway, she's already pissing him off. Then she disappears for 6 months, comes back. And she's like, hey, can I get my, it's like, hey, I'm back, when do I start again? It's like, and of course, he being the king jerk that he says, oh, yeah, no problem. Go ahead and start back on Monday. So Monday comes, her stuff is in a box by the door. Oh, by the way, I lied and wasted a week of your life.
Yes.
So get the fuck out.
Yeah.
So, Bruno.
The moral of the story is, even if your boss is a jerk, you treat him like the king because he is one.
And also, don't just disappear for 6 months at a time.
Mm-hmm. like, the moody cow is a different story because the moody cow can't keep workers at all. So, like, she can disappear for months on end, and the moody cow at the convenience store will still take her back.
Oh yeah, I've done convenience stores. If you can do midnights, you're basically the holy grail.
Yeah.
So you can theoretically get away with a lot.
Yeah, except your boss might let you get away with it, but your health won't.
Yeah.
So after working as a newspaper writer and a syndicated fiction writer, Bruno takes a stab at writing a novel.
And in the meantime, her friend Samantha has her doing copy editing work.
Yes, which is another, like, and Samantha is someone that she met through another creative profession she took a stab at, and that is acting. So she's been involved in a lot of creative work. Mm-hmm. So she either works at really low-paying retail jobs, or she works in creative jobs, fulfilling to very varying levels, but not necessarily well-paying enough to live on, even if she could really put her mind to sticking to them in the long term.
Right.
Which is another thing that I particularly relate to, considering that is how I have lived my entire 20s as well.
Yeah, so Bruno ends up doing Shakespeare. Mm-hmm. So she actually ends up hooking up with one of her castmates.
Yes, which is not necessarily a good idea.
Well, not only is it not a good idea, but this had to be the most dude bro of the dude bros that would go into drama. Mm-hmm. And let us not kid ourselves. Dude bros do make their way into drama club.
Yes.
Despite what movies and television have taught you, they're not all potentially flaming gays.
Yeah, there
are dude bros that show up, and they do dude bro things like expect women in their cast to totally do them. Mm-hmm.
And Bruno is just horny enough to take the bait. But you mentioned Samantha, and we were talking about before we started recording. I mentioned that Samantha and her partner Dana are two of the best people I think in the entire cast.
Right.
And they are a slightly older couple, older than Bruno at least, who are in a stable, committed relationship, but not married.
Yeah.
Despite being straight. And I think that's really interesting because, like, you would expect they're kind of bucking a lot of different trends. Mm-hmm. And I think the fact that they're not married is, number one, it's a signal that not all committed relationships are the same. Mm-hmm. You don't have to have every stable couple be a married couple or about to get married.
Right.
And also the fact that, like, they're both in creative professions and and they are very much an equal partnership. They do not conform to gender norms. And they have a very intimate and loving relationship that is, like, very apparent on the surface. Mm-hmm. So I was mentioning before that I think that they make really good model for Bruno to realize that you can have stability in your life and still have respect and creativity and flexibility, and you don't have to be locked into this, like, legal contract to always be the same person you always were.
Which just isn't possible.
Yeah.
You're not going to be the same person at 40 that you were at 20.
Yeah.
And if you are, you're doing life wrong.
The same man can't step into the same river twice.
Right.
Because the river will be different and the man will be different.
Hopefully the river will not be on fire.
Yes. But we have also people like Dan, who kind of expects something from a relationship that Bruno can't really give up, and that is consistency and reliability and a certain amount of prioritizing the relationship above other pursuits, at least as far as women are concerned.
And he is very passive-aggressive about this.
Yeah, because, well, I mean, he's a dude. He can't come right out and talk about his feelings.
So, I mean, Bruno is talking about up and leaving with Dana and Samantha for another acting run. And this is when Dan finally decides to lay it all out and explain to Bruno how he feels that this has been a mismanaged relationship on her part, that she has no time for him. And he says something really crass. He tells Bruno that the best you could hope for is someone that puts up with you.
Which is like, I mean, I think to an extent a lot of us suspect that, but like, damn, to hear that coming from someone who you've been in a relationship with for a while.
Someone who claims to love you.
It's really a shitty thing to say, and it's a really shitty thing to hear, too.
Bruno's response to this, I feel, is really classic, though.
Yes.
If the best I can hope for is to be tolerated, I'll just finger myself.
Yeah, like, and that's like, I really love that there are like blatant references to female masturbation. Like, because like female sexuality, especially like in the 90s, I mean, having women masturbating on camera was what got But I'm a Cheerleader to have a NC-17 rating. Because, like, you can't have women being openly sexual.
And that is something else that really impressed me about this comic, is it makes no bones about Bruno's sexuality, but it's never done in a male gazy sort of way.
Yeah.
Which, again, given the author of this comic, just makes it almost feels like the Impossible Burger, you know? Like, there's no way a Whopper could actually taste like a Whopper but still be veggie. You know, like, well, yeah, it can, apparently. Yeah.
I mean, like, it really flies in the face of all of our expectations. Mm-hmm. And not in a way, not in that it's unrealistic, because that's the thing. It is very realistic. Mm-hmm. And the fact that Bruno does experience anguish because of her sexuality, it is not directly because of her sexuality. It's because of other people's reactions to her sexuality.
She is not punished for being a quote-unquote slut.
Yes.
No matter how much that guy in New Orleans wanted it to.
And that's the other thing. Like, repeatedly throughout the series, there are people who Bruno is led to trust in some way. Mm-hmm. Who she thinks is going to respect her, and then it turns out there's something about her, whether it's because she's not Christian enough, or because she's not chaste enough, because she's not straight enough, mm-hmm. Or because she's just too independent. They end up being like, no, you don't live up to some arbitrary standard that I've set for you, and therefore you are bad. Mm-hmm. And
she rarely lets that get to her, but near the end of book 5, when Dana, Samantha, and her end up in New Orleans.
And she goes to visit what used to be a friend of hers.
Yes. And this friend of hers basically tells her on his doorstep, "You're a slut, get the hell out of my life."
And apparently he's been holding this grudge against her for years.
Yes.
Because
they were loosely associated at a point when Bruno was living in New Orleans.
Mm-hmm. And then he observed her, like, jumping into someone's bed a little bit too soon, but for his liking. And yeah, that apparently was enough to make him hate her.
Yeah. And she would normally have not taken it so personally, but this time she did.
Yeah, and Samantha's the one who really comforts her. Mm-hmm. That's like, again, this is someone who's like a little bit older and a lot more mature, mm-hmm. and living a much more stable life, who's telling her it's okay. your sexuality is not a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
You may have problems, but that's not one of them. And, like, really giving her unconditional acceptance, that I think was just, like, when I was reading those scenes, I was just like, I love this character. I wish she was in my life.
I think we all wish we had a Samantha in our lives. So I really enjoy the complexity of what's being told here. Mm-hmm. I also look at the fact, and I guess we are kind of, it is like we're sort of hammering home the fact that this was written by a cis white male.
Yes.
I'm assuming heterosexual at this point.
I'm not sure. I know that he had. I haven't really looked too hard into Christopher Baldwin's personal life.
We're living in this painfully ongoing argument with cis white men about their value in the world and their perceived superiority and whatever else.
And to be clear, we don't hate cis white men like inherently,
but there's a lot about them that sucks.
Yeah, and it's not for who they are, it's for what they do and the space that they occupy in the society. And, like, if you're a straight white man in our audience, first of all, thank you for coming this far without rage quitting. But also, like, all we really want is for you to acknowledge that you have a lot of privilege in this world. And your actions have a lot of weight. Yeah. Your words have impact that you might not necessarily know about. And frankly, you don't know what it's like to be a person of color or queer or female or all of those things. And when someone tells you that something's a problem, you really got to just shut up and listen. I mean, the person who's telling you that you're wrong may or may not be right, but you owe it to them to at least listen, especially if they think that you have personally hurt them.
But I feel that, and I think the reason why we're hammering this point home is that it kills the excuse.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
There is no excuse for a cis white male to write in these patriarchal standards.
Yeah.
To continue to hammer these points home. You can write complex, deep characters that are not reflections of yourself.
You can write romance that breaks boundaries and that goes against conventions. And you can write, like, intense character-driven stories with protagonists who look nothing like you.
And the thing about it, too, is there are so many writers and so many creative people that lean on the crutch. That think it's okay for them to stay in their limitations because of who they are.
Yeah.
Because this is what's considered normal. And it's like, no, you can work harder, you can work smarter, you can work better, you can do different things. And you don't have to be a, quote, social justice warrior to do it. You can be the change we need.
And yeah, there's the adage, write what you know, and you might not know. Like I said before, you don't know what it's like. But you can learn. It is possible to learn. And we hope you do. And one of the ways to do that is to really listen to the people who are different from you. Take them seriously and realize that they are people that are like you in some ways, that are just as complex and nuanced as you, if not more so. And also recognize that they have experiences that you might have to use some empathy and imagination to really get into.
And there is nothing about Bruno's story that is inherently feminine.
Yeah.
This could have easily been a story about a male college dropout.
Yeah, I think that there would be certain elements to the story that would lose a whole lot of their strength.
Yes.
If that were the case.
Yes.
We wouldn't have as much opportunity to explore stuff like slut shaming or gender expectations. Mm-hmm. But yeah, there is nothing about Bruno's character that is firmly rooted in her identity. Yeah. But it's the fact that she has her particular personality and character mm-hmm. with all of these identities that put her in a certain social position mm-hmm. that make her story all the more interesting because she's pushing against all of these structures and categories. And she is so stubborn and so headstrong mm-hmm. that she can't help but rebel against any box that you put her in.
I feel like protagonists in fiction usually fall into two categories, which is the character that the writer wants to be and the character the writer wants to know. And I get the impression that and some of the best characters in fiction are a combination of the two. The person you want to be and the person you want to know.
I can see that being the case, being the case with Bruno, being that Christopher Baldwin probably did want to know more about women and queer multiracial people through his writing. But I imagine he also has a lot of admiration for Bruno. There's a lot... She's a deeply, deeply flawed individual with lots of problems. I wouldn't wish her experiences on anybody because she goes through a lot of really hard stuff. But she's written with such love and affection. Her author loves her so much and admires her so much. I just it's really heartening to know that Bruno is there, both the comic and the character. She's just a wonderful person to know.
And I think that a lot of times when a male author is writing a female character, especially as a protagonist, going with that, person you want to be or person you want to know, when a male writer is writing a female character in the person they want to know, it's almost always in a sexual sense.
Yeah.
It's the, the warrior goddess, sort of the male power fantasy as a woman, or, she's this sexy femme fatale, or she, it's all about how beautiful it is and how sexy she is and whatever else. And there is no question that Bruno is meant to be a relatively attractive woman. Oh yeah,
I mean she's got some meat on her bones, but that's not disqualifying. Yeah, that she's got this beautiful big bouncy hair, sort of reminiscent of her African American heritage.
But she is never presented as a sexual object.
Yeah.
And she's not even portrayed as the, stereotypical sexually free woman who tosses off her clothes at a moment's notice for anybody. Yeah. Everyone that she's been with, there has been a purpose behind it.
She has no problem saying yes to sex, but she also has no problem saying no to sex. Yeah. And that's that is a very important distinction where slut shaming is concerned, and especially issues of consent. There's this Madonna whore dichotomy where it's either you're the kind of girl who says yes or the kind of girl who says no. Well, what if we are all both?
Yeah.
And yeah, Bruno really she will have the sex that she wants, but she will not let anyone take that to mean that they are entitled to her. If that's something that you like in a character, definitely read Bruno.
Yeah. So, and something I was telling you when I was reading this was that I am not used to seeing this kind of character, being portrayed. And when I was growing up, I didn't really have access to the internet, so even if I had internet access, even I found Bruno anyway. And I probably wouldn't have known what to do with her at 15.
No,
Because-
I imagine not.
because-
You still had some growing to do.
Well, not only that, but I was still under the impression that I was male. And, the comic books I were used to, the big muscles and the big guns and the, male power fantasy times 20 and, written by supposedly 20-something-year-old men who have never really grown past 12. And that's not to say all comic writers, even in that period, were. That was what was popular at the time.
So I first encountered this strip after it ended in the mid-2000s. And at that time, I was either close to finishing high school or I had recently finished high school. So I was entering my 20s. And I knew I related very strongly to Bruno. I was entering the phase of life that she spends the entire series moving through. I didn't know what was in store for me in my 20s, and I did not anticipate how much my life would come to resemble hers. Especially since, it wasn't until my late 20s that I came out as trans, so I was living as a woman. I was openly bisexual, although I never ended up having any relationships with women. My relationships often followed a similar pattern to Bruno's relationships with men. That is, they would be short and intense, and they would end because her partner had some standard that she could not live up to. And I struggled with the tension between my desire to have sex in the context of committed, stable relationships and my rebellion against the social stigma against sluts. And my desire to have more sex than I was having.
Yeah.
I also had, I came of age during the Great Recession of the mid to late 2000s.
So you're used to not having money.
I'm used to not having any job prospects whatsoever. I was a college dropout. I was very much an aimless wanderer. I didn't wander quite as much geographically as Bruno did, but I wandered through different political and religious affiliations, different social groups, different hobbies, different career aspirations. I was always a writer, though, and I was always searching for something meaningful to hold on to. And I really appreciate that during that time, I already knew the story of Bruno because I read the entire thing before I really got into the meat of my 20s. And that really made a huge difference for me. I had this archetype to contextualize the fact that I had this adultolescence that I was going through. And I'm still kind of going through it. But I've definitely found a whole lot more stability, not necessarily in the materiality of my life, but in my self-image and my self-concept and in what I want to get out of my life.
Yeah, this is definitely a comic I needed to discover later in life. I spent a decent chunk of my life in a hole, more or less. The only thing I ever really wanted in my life was stability, so I sought it in every possibility. I didn't wander, I didn't roam, I didn't take risks. I did everything I could to just stay in one place. And I still feel like that's how I am. And so being like Bruno doesn't really appeal to me. But at the same time, it would be nice to know somebody that was like that. If just for...
the stories they could tell.
It's a good, it's a really good story. And I'm glad that this sort of thing was thriving
Yeah.
on a platform at a time when it wouldn't have survived elsewhere.
Yeah. I think, and since Bruno, the creator, I haven't really looked into everything that he's done more recently, but he's written since then a fit for syndication children's comic strip called Little D, which is a little bit like if Bruno was a small child. And yeah, the main character of Little D really looks a lot like Bruno. She's a little girl with big poofy curly hair, and he's also written for several years now a sci-fi story called Space Trawler, which I read for the first couple months of its run, and then I got distracted. I didn't necessarily lose interest, but I would like to catch up on Space Trawler, and maybe we could do an episode about that in the future.
Okay.
It has another diverse cast and of not only humans, but of aliens.
Yay!
So that would be exciting to look into.
We didn't talk about Amy.
Oh, yes, we should definitely talk about Amy.
Okay, go ahead and set this one up.
All right, so Amy is Bruno's cousin, I believe.
Yes.
And a much younger cousin.
I think she's like 4 or 5 when we first meet her.
She's very young when we first meet her, and this is when Bruno's in her early 20s. And Bruno is tasked with babysitting Amy while her parents are traveling.
Mm-hmm.
And Bruno thoroughly corrupts this young child.
Yes.
And teaches her the horrors of patriarchy and capitalism, and teaches her the concept of fair trade coffee.
Mm-hmm.
And then after introducing Amy to all these subversive ideas and culture and new political concepts, just gives her back to her parents, who are not at all happy with what Bruno has done to their sweet innocent child. And that is definitely played for comedy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of wacky hijinks. Ooh, I'm in my early 20s and I've been trusted with a child. Let's see how much damage I can do. And it turns out, and this is another great thing about the storytelling in this series, is that we get to see the consequences. Because Amy doesn't just disappear from Bruno's life.
Yeah.
They kind of don't. They are in very limited contact for several years after that.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next time we meet Amy, she's a teenager.
I think she's more like 10.
Yeah, a preteen.
Yeah.
And she kind of hates Bruno.
Mm-hmm.
Or at very least has very negative feelings toward her. Because all she knows is this mystical cousin of hers swooped into her life, showed her all these amazing things, and then disappeared. And made her parents hate her. And we realize that, yeah, Bruno has definitely taught Amy a lot of really cool and interesting things about the world and about the possibilities that are open to her.
Mm-hmm.
But then in the process disrupted Amy's development and her relationship to her parents in a way that was really damaging.
Yeah.
Because children don't just need wings, they need roots.
One of the worst things you can do to a child is convince them that their parents don't love them.
Yeah.
And that's what happened with Amy. Was Amy became convinced that this indoctrination from Bruno permanently tainted her relationship with her parents.
And that may have been so, because from what Amy's parents have said, they don't seem to be interested in supporting Amy as a person now that she's been corrupted. And they're talking about we're gonna let Bruno babysit Amy again, not because we trust her anymore, but because the damage is already done. And that's a really problematic view to have towards your own child.
Yeah.
But also, like...
I almost have to commend the parents on their honesty, though.
Yeah.
Because a lot of parents in that situation would not be bold enough as to openly give up.
Yeah. So Bruno has this chance to repair her relationship with Amy. And what I think that really teaches Bruno is that just because she knows and acknowledges that she might be a bad influence on this child doesn't mean that she is going to be spared the consequences of her actions. Mm-hmm. She has done the horrible crime of treating her cousin like a human being. Mm-hmm. And as a result, her cousin is behaving like a human being with thoughts and ideas of her own and with an independent view of herself, and who will no longer look up to Bruno as this uncomplicated mentor figure, but instead as this really complicated disruption in her life that she has very mixed feelings toward. I kind of wonder what it's like to be Amy sometimes. I wonder if that's something like how a lot of queer people feel. If they've been, like, especially queer people whose parents are not accepting, who maybe fall into a subculture that accepts them for who they are, but also introduces them to ideas and behaviors that lead them further away from the parents that they still really need and rely on. It's not okay that parents are allowed to have this stranglehold on their children's ideas, but it's also not okay to deny the importance of that relationship.
I have a very complicated relationship with my family, in the sense that there are a lot of ways in which I am Amy.
Yeah.
In the sense that I was, in a sense, too smart for my family. And that I was radically different, and that there was very little you could do to convince me to be normal. My parents have somewhat adapted to the changes over the years. My mom has just completely shut me out as far as anything beyond her understanding of who she thinks I am. She is the one parent I attempted to come out completely to, the one that I actually tried to have the trans conversation with. I am confused. Whatever it is I'm experiencing, it's my mental illness, it's my autism, it's, whatever else. And the thing is that my youngest sibling is also transitioning. In fact,
really?
My mom completely denies all of that. And this is the favorite kid, too.
Oh.
And it's pretty bad when you know who your parents' favorite kid is, and it's not you. So
yeah, I could have some thoughts about that.
So that is clearly me. I am the villain in a lot of these situations. But yes, I attempted to have this conversation with my mom, and she has completely shut it out. My stepmother couldn't get past bisexual, and she is the heavy evangelical. So, I am dealing with, especially when I'm dealing with like the worst of my depression and trying to get on disability and that. So this is within the last couple of years before she separated from my dad again. There was this open resentment towards me and towards that part of my identity, because her first marriage was to a closeted gay man who may or may not have exposed her to HIV.
So she was a beard.
He was a very controlling person, and their relationship was very abusive. Between her faith and how gay people are portrayed in the faith, and her experiences with this gay man who died of AIDS after the divorce and hooking up with his boyfriend and whatever else, she decided that all gay people are like that. And when I attempted to try to tell her, no, we're not all like that, she shuts it down completely. No, that's what you're getting into. So that's the last time I even bothered to talk about my sexuality with her, unless she brings it up. And she only brings it up because someone she went to church with, it turns out her daughter is a lesbian, and the girlfriend of this daughter is a lot like me. She doesn't like to leave home. Mm-hmm. And I was asking, okay, what kind of programs are there for LGBTQ folk in Canton? And I'm kind of shrugging like, I'm still trying to find them. And so that's the relationship. And my dad doesn't even bring it up. Like, my dad has just decided we're not having this conversation for whatever reasons. And I've decided I'm okay with that.
Yeah. Why mess with something that is at very least stable?
And that's the thing is, right now I have probably the best relationship I've ever had with my dad. And I've talked about my complicated relationship with my dad here before, so you're aware. But yeah, right now I have what's probably the best relationship I've ever had with my dad. And it's not like I'm pretending to be someone else. It's just he doesn't call me the right name. And I'm not going to have that conversation with him because it feels like it's going to be more trouble than it's worth. It isn't necessarily the fear of rejection. It's the exhaustion of having to re-explain everything over and over.
I have come to the decision to basically take that attitude toward my grandparents, who are both old enough that their brains are not working anymore. Mm-hmm. And these are the grandparents who are still living anyway. Yeah. And I know that I would have to get them to reconsider beliefs that they've held for their entire lives, which is well over 80 years now. Yeah. And I would rather have my relationship stay roughly the same with them than risk losing it in their last years. Yeah. Especially since there's almost a zero chance that they will understand. Mm-hmm.
My grandfather died about a week and a half ago.
Yeah.
And last Tuesday was the funeral. And through the calling hours, which was Monday night, and the service on Tuesday and afterwards, this side of the family has never made any bones about considering me the problem child. I am a burden to be endured.
Best you can hope for is to be tolerated.
Fuck that, I'll finger myself.
That's why God gave us fingers.
But that's that sort of the thing is I can kind of feel for Amy because the hardest part is feeling like your parents don't love you. Yeah. And my dad has gone a decent way to try to restore a relationship that was lost. Mm-hmm. There are things that he's never going to be able to do, that he's never going to be able to fix. Mm-hmm. And at the moment, I'm choosing to be like, you know what? I'm just going to take what I can get. My mom, on the other hand, not so much. So Amy's narrative kind of hits home in the sense that you're too weird for your parents.
And Amy was young enough when Bruno first encountered her that she probably could have gone straight back to the life she had been. She probably could have swallowed whatever cultural or political beliefs her parents wanted her to have at that point. Her worldview was still very fluid. But she must have been intelligent enough and mature enough at the age of 5 or 6 that she could tell that Bruno's view of the world was at very least made more sense than the one that her parents were presenting her with. And she did not go back. And she felt very complex feelings about that. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, she on some level made the choice to not allow herself to be pigeonholed by the life that her parents wanted for her. And that, I think, is a testament to Amy's strength and courage as a person. Mm-hmm. And it means that her childhood is probably a whole lot harder than it would have been otherwise. Yeah. But ultimately, I think in the long term, like, I could picture her, because, like, as, like, she would be in her 20s or maybe 30s now.
Yeah.
Wow, she would be on the front lines of the SJW, revolution.
Yeah.
She would be at all of the anti-Trump protests.
Mm-hmm.
She would be the purple-haired, non-binary SJW of like, not that I assume that I know her gender identity, but like, she would definitely be like fully at home in all of the queer movements that are blossoming right now. And it's just wonderful to like think that that's the future that awaits her. And now I'm like conflating reality with fiction, and I don't really care, because these characters are very real to me.
I think another part of it too is I feel that Amy would be smart enough to realize that when she's like 17, 18, you know, and she can like call the doctors for herself, like, you know what, I probably need to go into therapy. I need to talk some stuff out.
And we will meet Amy again before this series is over.
Good.
I can tell you that much. And it ends up being an interesting coincidence, but I will leave it at that.
All right.
So, shall we end this episode?
I feel we've unless there's something else you feel we should cover.
I think we've got the main points.
Okay.
So, Bruno, Christopher Baldwin, look it up. It's worth reading. I think it's available in print still, but it's also still available online. Otherwise, this has been False Dichotomies. I'm Cy Castells.
I'm Daria Quinn, and thank you for spending your time with us.
The arc itself is... Oh, there's a dog out there that I'm looking at.
Oh, yeah.
Gotta get distracted by the dog.
Okay.
Sorry about that. So,